February 1943. A windowless briefing room inside the German Armaments Ministry, Berlin. The walls are bare except for mats pinned with neat precision, arrows pointing east, west, south. Cigarette smoke hangs low, unmoving. Papers are passed quietly between officers. No speeches, no rhetoric, only numbers. One report lists aircraft losses over the Reich. Another details U-boat sinkings in the Atlantic. A third, newly arrived, outlines American production figures, steel output, ship launches, aircraft assembly rates. An officer reads them twice, slowly. He does not argue. He does not question the source. He simply exhales. Outside, Germany is still fighting. The Wehrmacht remains disciplined. The Luftwaffe still rises to meet bombers. The war on the surface continues as it always has, but inside this room, something has shifted. The figures do not describe battles. They describe momentum. They describe factories that replace losses faster than they can be inflicted. They describe an enemy whose strength does not diminish with sacrifice. No one speaks of defeat. That word is never used. Instead, there is silence, heavy, deliberate, a quiet understanding shared among professionals who recognize a reality that cannot be changed by courage or doctrine. Because by early 1943, German officers are beginning to realize that the war is no longer being decided at the front. It is being decided far from it. To understand why German officers began quietly reassessing the war in 1943, it is necessary to look beyond the battlefield and into the assumptions that had shaped Germany's strategy from the very beginning. Nazi Germany did not plan for a long war against the industrial powers of the world. Blitzkrieg was not merely a tactic, it was an economic necessity. Germany lacked the raw materials, oil reserves, and industrial depth to sustain prolonged global conflict. Speed was meant to compensate for scarcity. Decisive campaigns would destroy enemies before production disparities could matter. This logic appeared sound in the late 1930s. Poland collapsed in weeks. France fell in 6. The Low Countries were overrun with precision and shock. Even Britain, though not unconquered, was pushed to the brink. German officers, particularly in the Wehrmacht High Command, believed they had discovered a modern formula for victory. Coordinated armor, mobile infantry, close air support, and operational tempo so relentless that the enemy could not recover. But this formula depended on one critical assumption, that Germany's enemies would break politically before industrial imbalance became decisive. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, that assumption became dangerously fragile. Germany did not declare war on America because it feared American armies. It declared war because it believed American power would take years to materialize, and that Britain and the Soviet Union would be defeated before that moment arrived. In early 1942, many German officers still believed this. American troops were inexperienced. Their officers were untested. Their equipment appeared bulky and inefficient compared to German designs. Reports from North Africa described American units retreating under pressure. Luftwaffe pilots mocked the robustness of American aircraft as crude over-engineering. But beneath this surface confidence, German intelligence analysts were already tracking something more troubling. American shipyards were launching vessels at a rate unseen in history. Liberty ships, unglamorous, utilitarian cargo vessels, were sliding into the Atlantic every few days. These ships did not win battles, but they made battles possible. They fed Britain. They supplied the Soviet Union. They carried oil, steel, food, ammunition, everything required to sustain modern war. German U-boat commanders noticed the change first. Sinkings increased, but shipping losses no longer crippled Allied logistics. Where gaps once appeared in convoy lanes, new ships filled them almost immediately. Escorts multiplied, radar improved, aircraft coverage expanded farther into the Atlantic. By mid-1942, Admiral Karl Donitz began warning that the tonnage war was shifting, not because U-boats were failing tactically, but because American production was overwhelming losses faster than submarines could inflict them. At the same time, reports from the Eastern Front painted a grim parallel. German divisions were still fighting effectively, but replacement equipment arrived slower each month. Tanks damaged in combat were cannibalized for parts. Trucks were immobilized by fuel shortages. Winter clothing arrived late, or not at all. In contrast, intelligence from the Soviet rear, filtered through reconnaissance and interrogations, described endless rail movements carrying American trucks, locomotives, and food. Lend-Lease was not symbolic, it was structural. American factories were feeding the Red Army's mobility. By early 1943, these threads converged. At Stalingrad, the Sixth Army was destroyed, not because of lack of courage, but because of lack of fuel, ammunition, and airlift capacity. German transport aircraft were shot down faster than they could be replaced. Each loss was permanent. There were no reserves. Meanwhile, American bomber streams over Germany grew larger with each passing month. Aircraft shot down in daylight raids reappeared in greater numbers weeks later. Luftwaffe intelligence officers noticed something disturbing. German estimates of American aircraft losses were accurate, but meaningless. The enemy did not shrink. German industry worked relentlessly, but it was constrained by bombing, resource shortages, and bureaucratic fragmentation. American industry, by contrast, was unified, protected by oceans, and expanding rapidly. Production targets were not goals, they were minimums. Inside German command circles, this realization was not shouted, it was whispered. Officers compared notes quietly. Quartermasters adjusted projections downward. Staff planners recalculated timelines that no longer made sense. The war was still being fought. Orders were still obeyed. Faith in victory was still demanded publicly. But privately, a different understanding was forming. Because once industrial momentum turns, battles stop being decisive and start becoming symptoms. And that understanding would deepen as the numbers became impossible to ignore. By the spring of 1943, the war had entered a phase that German planners had never intended to face. The Eastern Front no longer promised a decisive collapse. Operation Barbarossa had failed to destroy the Soviet Union in a single campaign. Instead, it had opened a front that consumed men, fuel, ammunition, and machinery at an unsustainable rate. Every kilometer advanced eastward lengthened supply lines. Every winter magnified shortages. And every loss, tank, aircraft, trained crew, was irreplaceable in ways Germany could no longer disguise. At the same time, the air war over Europe was transforming into something entirely new. American daylight bombing doctrine rejected the idea of limited raids. It embraced persistence. Bomber streams grew not because missions were succeeding flawlessly, but because losses were anticipated, absorbed, and replaced. German fighter commanders noticed a pattern that deeply unsettled them. Even when interception was effective, even when formations were broken and aircraft destroyed, the size of subsequent raids did not diminish. By mid-1943, the United States was producing aircraft at a rate that exceeded German estimates by wide margins. Factories in California, Michigan, and Texas operated continuously. Assembly lines refined techniques that reduced production time with every iteration. Aircraft designs emphasized reliability, ease of maintenance, and pilot survivability, qualities that allowed damaged planes to return to service instead of being written off. German aircraft, by contrast, were technologically advanced but fragile. Precision engineering required skilled labor and rare materials. Production delays mounted as bombing disrupted supply chains. Even successful designs could not be manufactured in sufficient numbers to offset attrition. This disparity extended beyond aircraft. American armored production surged. Sherman tanks, often dismissed by German crews as inferior in direct combat, appeared in numbers that negated tactical advantage. A German Panther might destroy multiple Shermans, but replacements arrived faster than German losses could be repaired. German officers began to understand that battlefield superiority mattered less when the enemy could afford to lose. Fuel shortages compounded the problem. Germany's access to oil was limited and increasingly vulnerable. Synthetic fuel plants became priority bombing targets. Luftwaffe sorties were curtailed. Training hours for pilots were reduced to conserve aviation fuel. Tank crews drilled less. Naval operations were restricted. Meanwhile, American forces trained at full scale. Pilots logged hundreds of hours before entering combat. Armored units maneuvered constantly. Exercises were repeated, refined, institutionalized. Experience was not hoarded, it was industrialized. Within the German officer corps, this reality produced a quiet fracture. Ideological loyalty remained publicly absolute, but professional soldiers, men trained to evaluate capability rather than belief, could not ignore the evidence accumulating around them. Field commanders reported shortages they could not overcome with ingenuity. Logistics officers warned that replacement schedules no longer matched loss rates. Intelligence analysts tracked American production curves that rose steadily, unaffected by German successes. Albert Speer's reorganization of armaments production did achieve remarkable increases in output, but even at its peak, German industry could not match the scale of its adversaries combined, let alone the United States alone. Speer himself would later acknowledge that by 1943, the war was a race Germany could not win. This realization did not lead to collapse, it led to adaptation, defensive strategies, delayed offensives, increased reliance on miracle weapons, and hoped-for breakthroughs. But these were responses, not solutions. German officers understood something fundamental by this point. The war had escaped the realm of maneuver and entered the realm of endurance. And endurance favored the side whose factories, farms, and shipyards lay beyond reach. This understanding set the stage for how German officers would later interpret every engagement, not as an isolated battle, but as another data point in an equation that was no longer in their favor. That shift in perspective would define how they fought the remainder of the war. Among German officers trained in the traditions of the Prussian General Staff, war was meant to be analyzed, measured, and understood without illusion. By 1943, many of these officers had reached a conclusion they did not voice openly, but carried into every briefing and order. American industrial power had altered the nature of combat itself. Losses that would cripple a German formation were for the United States an accepted operational cost. A destroyed bomber group did not trigger retreat or reassessment, it triggered a production schedule. Frontline reports increasingly reflected this awareness. Officers noted that American units reappeared with full strength after engagements that should have required months of recovery. Divisions rotated out briefly, then returned with fresh equipment and replacements who were trained, supplied, and confident. This consistency unsettled German commanders, accustomed to exploiting exhaustion and scarcity. The officer corps understood that tactical brilliance could no longer compensate for structural imbalance. War diaries from 1943 reveal a shift in tone, less confidence in decisive victories, more emphasis on delaying actions, preservation of forces, and inflicting maximum cost for engagement. The goal was no longer to win outright, but to survive long enough for circumstances to change. And yet, circumstances did not change. Nowhere was industrial disparity more visible than in the skies. German fighter pilots faced an enemy that learned faster than it weakened. Early American bombing raids suffered heavy casualties, but formations adapted. Escort fighters extended their range. Tactics evolved. Losses declined, not because Germans lost skill, but because Americans absorbed lessons and applied them at scale. German fighter commanders noticed a pattern that deeply unsettled them. Even when interception was effective, even when formations were broken and aircraft destroyed, the size of subsequent raids did not diminish. By mid-1943, the United States was producing aircraft at a rate that exceeded German estimates by wide margins. Factories in California, Michigan, and Texas operated continuously. Assembly lines refined techniques that reduced production time with every iteration. Aircraft designs emphasized reliability, ease of maintenance, and pilot survivability.
qualities that allowed damaged planes to return to service instead of being written off. German aircraft, by contrast, were technologically advanced but fragile. Precision engineering required skilled labor and rare materials. Production delays mounted as bombing disrupted supply chains. Even successful designs could not be manufactured in sufficient numbers to offset attrition. This disparity extended beyond aircraft. American armored production surged. Sherman tanks, often dismissed by German crews as inferior in direct combat, appeared in numbers that negated tactical advantage. A German Panther might destroy multiple Shermans, but replacements arrived faster than German losses could be repaired. German officers began to understand that battlefield superiority mattered less when the enemy could afford to lose. Fuel shortages compounded the problem. Germany's access to oil was limited and increasingly vulnerable. Synthetic fuel plants became priority bombing targets. Luftwaffe sorties were curtailed. Training hours for pilots were reduced to conserve aviation fuel. Tank crews drilled less. Naval operations were restricted. Meanwhile, American forces trained at full scale. Pilots logged hundreds of hours before entering combat. Armored units maneuvered constantly. Exercises were repeated, refined, institutionalized. Experience was not hoarded, it was industrialized. Within the German officer corps, this reality produced a quiet fracture. Ideological loyalty remained publicly absolute, but professional soldiers, men trained to evaluate capability rather than belief, could not ignore the evidence accumulating around them. Field commanders reported shortages they could not overcome with ingenuity. Logistics officers warned that replacement schedules no longer matched loss rates. Intelligence analysts tracked American production curves that rose steadily, unaffected by German successes. Albert Speer's reorganization of armaments production did achieve remarkable increases in output, but even at its peak, German industry could not match the scale of its adversaries combined, let alone the United States alone. Speer himself would later acknowledge that by 1943, the war was a race Germany could not win. This realization did not lead to collapse, it led to adaptation, defensive strategies, delayed offensives, increased reliance on miracle weapons and hoped-for breakthroughs, but these were responses, not solutions. German officers understood something fundamental by this point. The war had escaped the realm of maneuver and entered the realm of endurance. And endurance favored the side whose factories, farms, and shipyards lay beyond reach. This understanding set the stage for how German officers would later interpret every engagement, not as an isolated battle, but as another data point in an equation that was no longer in their favor. That shift in perspective would define how they fought the remainder of the war. Among German officers trained in the
German officers in 1943 increasingly described American logistics not as support, but as a combat arm in itself. Captured documents and battlefield observation revealed a system that anticipated loss rather than reacting to it. Fuel depots were redundant, supply routes overlapped, ports unloaded faster than German intelligence believed possible. When rail lines were damaged, American engineers rebuilt them with a speed that defied pre-war calculations. To German planners, logistics had always been a constraint to be managed carefully. To the Americans, it appeared to be a force multiplier, something that expanded with pressure instead of collapsing under it. An armored thrust that stalled German units for weeks could be followed by another, equally strong, with no visible exhaustion in the supply chain behind it. Officers began to recognize that destroying enemy formations was no longer enough. Entire systems had to be broken simultaneously. Factories, ports, transport hubs, training pipelines. But Germany no longer had the reach, fuel, or air superiority to do so. The realization settled quietly. The battlefield was only the surface of the war. At the higher command levels, German officers learned to choose their words carefully. Official reports still spoke of tactical successes, delayed advances, and inflicted casualties. But between the lines, a different message circulated in private briefings and personal correspondence. American strength was not accidental. It was planned, structured, and sustained by an economy mobilized without internal contradiction. Some officers compared it unfavorably to Germany's own war economy. Delayed mobilization, political interference, and competing priorities had fragmented production. American industry, by contrast, appeared unified. Civilian life reorganized around output, transportation, and standardization. What shocked many German commanders was not just the volume of American production, but its consistency. No dramatic surges, no collapses, just relentless continuity. In a war built on momentum, consistency was decisive. By late 1943, German officers no longer described American forces as inexperienced or tactically naive. The early stereotypes faded under repeated contact. American units learned from mistakes, adapted doctrine, and applied technology aggressively. They fought methodically, supported by artillery, air power, and logistics that arrived on schedule. This forced a psychological adjustment. The enemy was no longer something to outmaneuver once and defeat. It was a system that corrected itself faster than German forces could exploit weaknesses. Quietly, among professionals, respect replaced underestimation. And respect, when paired with numerical imbalance, led to a conclusion few dared to state aloud. The war's direction had already been set. That realization carried German officers into the decisive moments that followed, moments where industry met battlefield reality. By the summer of 1943, the abstract assessments made in offices and reports began to crystallize on the battlefield. Sicily, July 1943. German officers watching the Allied landings saw something that unsettled them more than the scale of the invasion itself. The landings did not feel improvised. They unfolded with a mechanical certainty. Waves of men, vehicles, fuel, ammunition, all arriving in sequence, all synchronized. When one beachhead met resistance, another absorbed the pressure. When roads clogged, engineers cleared them. When equipment was lost, replacements appeared without delay. For German commanders, this was not how invasions were supposed to look. Traditionally, amphibious operations were fragile. Weather, timing, and logistics could unravel them within hours. Yet the American-led forces absorbed friction without visible strain. Losses were acknowledged, but they did not slow the tempo. Units that should have been exhausted continued advancing. Artillery barrages were followed by fresh infantry. Air cover remained constant. Reports from Sicily reached Berlin and the Eastern Front almost simultaneously. Officers noted the same pattern. American operations did not peak and fade, they sustained. Then came the air war. By late 1943, daylight bombing over Germany intensified. American bomber formations arrived not as isolated raids, but as rolling schedules. Factories struck one week were struck again the next. Repair efforts lagged behind the rhythm of attack. German officers studying damage reports saw an uncomfortable truth. Production losses mattered less to the Americans than production pressure. They were not trying to destroy everything at once. They were trying to exhaust the system. The decisive realization followed quietly. Even when American planes were shot down, replacements filled the skies. Crews rotated. Training pipelines continued. Fuel shortages that crippled German responses did not seem to exist on the other side. The battlefield had become a demonstration, and German officers, trained to read signs of strategic imbalance, recognized that the demonstration was meant to be seen. The war was no longer about whether Germany could win individual battles. It was about whether it could survive the pace of what was coming next. That pace accelerated toward moments where denial was no longer possible. The final certainty arrived not with a single defeat, but with a convergence. Autumn 1943. From Italy, from the Atlantic, from the skies above Germany, the same reports accumulated. American divisions were not thinning. American air strength was not ebbing.
American shipping losses, once expected to be decisive, had become statistical footnotes. The U-boat war, the strategy Germany had trusted to choke the industrial lifeline, was failing. German naval officers knew why. Liberty ships were being launched faster than submarines could sink them. Entire convoys crossed the Atlantic under continuous escort, protected by radar, air patrols, and improved anti-submarine tactics. Sink one ship, and 3 more arrived behind it. Even victories no longer altered outcomes. At the highest levels of the Wehrmacht, discussions changed tone. Not public speeches, not propaganda. Quiet briefings, margin notes, conversations after the maps were rolled away. The Americans, German officers admitted, had turned war into a production problem and then solved it. Factories destroyed by bombing were repaired slowly. Factories destroyed by manpower shortages could not be repaired at all. Fuel rationing forced Luftwaffe units to stand down. Training hours were cut. Pilots were sent into combat underprepared. Meanwhile, intelligence reports described American pilots flying hundreds of hours before deployment, rotating home, replaced by new crews drawn from an industrial training system that never paused. This imbalance reached its starkest expression in the skies. In October 1943, during the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids, German fighters inflicted heavy losses on American bombers. It should have been a turning point. Instead, it became proof of futility. Within weeks, the bomber streams returned, larger, better escorted, more resilient. German commanders understood the implication immediately. Attrition favored the side that could absorb it. Germany could not. By late 1943, senior officers no longer spoke of victory in strategic terms. They spoke of delay, of prolongation, of buying time. The language itself was an admission. The American industrial engine, once underestimated, was now acknowledged as decisive. The realization settled without drama. Germany was fighting not an army, but a system, and systems once fully mobilized did not tire. That understanding framed everything that followed: the defensive posture of 1944, the desperation of last-ditch weapons, and the quiet knowledge that no battlefield success could reverse the arithmetic already set in motion. The war would continue, but its outcome, to those who could read the signs, had already been written in steel, fuel, and assembly lines.
By early 1944, the consequences of that realization began to shape German decisions in subtle but unmistakable ways. There was no formal declaration of defeat, no single meeting where officers conceded the war was lost. Instead, the acknowledgement expressed itself through adjustments, small, telling shifts in strategy that betrayed a deeper understanding. German planning no longer assumed decisive victory, it assumed survival. Resources were redirected not to win, but to endure. The Luftwaffe, once envisioned as an offensive instrument capable of dominating skies from Poland to the Channel, was reconfigured into a defensive shield. Fighter production surged, but pilot training collapsed under fuel shortages. Aircraft left factories faster than trained crews could be assigned to them. Experienced pilots were flown continuously, without rest, without replacement. Their losses were irreplaceable. In contrast, American air forces expanded without cannibalizing their own foundations. Training bases across the United States continued to operate at full tempo. Pilots rotated home, crews were rested, replaced, and reinforced. Every German victory in the air carried a silent cost imbalance that favored the Americans. On the ground, the pattern repeated. German divisions in France and Italy were ordered to hold terrain at all costs, not because the ground was decisive, but because time itself had become the objective. Every month delayed was a month hoped for political fracture among the Allies, a technological breakthrough, or a miracle weapon that might reset the balance. The so-called Wunderwaffen, jet aircraft, advanced rockets, new tanks, were not conceived as tools of conquest, but as potential equalizers against overwhelming production. German officers knew these systems were late.
They also knew they were insufficient in number, but they represented the last remaining variable in a war otherwise governed by arithmetic. Meanwhile, American output accelerated. By mid-1944, the United States was producing aircraft at a rate Germany could not even approximate. Trucks, tanks, artillery, radios, everything arrived not in tens or hundreds, but in thousands. Entire divisions crossed oceans, fully equipped, supplied, and fed. German intelligence reports became increasingly blunt. They described American depots stacked with fuel and ammunition beyond immediate need, airfields expanding faster than reconnaissance could track, replacement units waiting in reserve, not because they were needed, but because they could be spared. The war Germany had prepared for, a short, decisive conflict shaped by maneuver and shock, had transformed into a prolonged industrial struggle it could not sustain. And by the time Allied forces landed in Normandy, many German officers understood that the invasion itself was not the beginning of defeat, but its confirmation. What followed was no longer a contest of equals, but the visible collapse of a system pushed beyond its limits under the weight of an enemy whose capacity seemed inexhaustible. That collapse, however, would not be immediate. It would unfold over months, measured in destroyed divisions, lost air superiority, and a shrinking margin of choice. From the summer of 1944 onward, the imbalance German officers had quietly acknowledged became impossible to disguise. After Normandy, every retreat revealed the same pattern. Allied units withdrew, regrouped, and returned stronger. German formations withdrew thinner, weaker, and increasingly hollow. Equipment losses were no longer replaced like for like. Tanks abandoned for lack of fuel, artillery left behind without tractors, entire units reduced to cadres, still bearing divisional numbers but lacking divisional strength. German commanders began writing reports that no longer spoke of victory conditions. They spoke of holding capacity, of delay value, of expenditure ratios. Language itself shifted from ambition to attrition. On the Eastern Front, the same truth emerged with brutal clarity. As Soviet offensives surged westward, German units encountered American-built trucks, radios, aircraft fuel, and food supplies delivered through Lend-Lease. German officers fighting in Poland and East Prussia remarked with bitter clarity that they were not facing one industrial power, but several, fused into a single operational system. Even when German formations achieved local success, it meant little. A destroyed American or Allied unit did not create an opening, it created a scheduling problem, one that Allied planners solved by committing reserves already waiting. German success could no longer generate momentum, it could only slow the inevitable. The Luftwaffe's collapse followed the same logic. Jet aircraft like the Me-262 entered service, technologically superior in speed, but too few, too late, and starved of trained pilots and fuel. German engineers produced brilliance. German industry could not scale it. American industry, meanwhile, scaled everything, often sacrificing perfection for quantity, reliability, and speed of deployment. By late 1944, internal assessments within the German High Command acknowledged what had once been unspeakable. The United States was not just winning battles, it was setting the terms of time itself. German factories worked under bombardment, dispersed, relocated, disrupted. American factories worked uninterrupted, protected by oceans and distance. One side repaired damage, the other endured it. This disparity shaped the final German offensives. The Ardennes attack was not conceived as a sustainable campaign. It was a calculated gamble, a final attempt to impose shock before American production could absorb yet another blow. Even its planners understood the window was narrow, the resources insufficient, the margin for failure non-existent. When that gamble failed, there was no reserve behind it, only exhaustion. By early 1945, German officers no longer spoke privately of American industrial power as an abstract threat. They spoke of it as the decisive fact of the war, the variable that had determined every outcome, even when tactics, leadership, and courage had momentarily masked it. The realization came too late to change strategy, but not too late to shape memory. In post-war interrogations and memoirs, German generals repeatedly returned to the same conclusion. They had underestimated not American soldiers, but the system that sustained them, the factories, the logistics, the ability to lose and return unchanged. And in that admission lay the quiet truth of the war's end. The battlefield had been decided long before the final shots were fired. What remained now was to understand what that meant for history, for warfare, and for the future shaped in its wake. In the end, the war did not conclude with a single decisive engagement, nor with a moment of sudden collapse. It ended the way it had been decided, quietly, mechanically, through the exhaustion of one system and the endurance of another. German officers entered the war believing that skill, discipline, and operational brilliance could offset material disadvantage. For a time, that belief seemed justified. Maneuver warfare worked, speed compensated for scarcity, precision masked limitation. But those methods depended on momentum, and momentum requires fuel, steel, rubber, men, and time. American industrial power altered the meaning of all three. It removed finality from defeat. It transformed loss into delay. It turned destruction into a temporary condition. Where German planning assumed that destruction equaled elimination, American planning assumed recovery. Where German industry strained under pressure, American industry expanded under it. And where German commanders sought decisive outcomes, American commanders built systems that made decisiveness unnecessary. This difference reshaped modern warfare. Victory no longer belonged solely to the most skilled or the most daring. It belonged to those who could sustain complexity, who could move men, machines, and materials across continents without breaking. The Second World War did not simply prove this principle, it enforced it. For Germany, the realization came too late. Officers recognized the imbalance only after they were already trapped within it, fighting a war whose rules no longer favored them. They could delay defeat, but they could not escape arithmetic. For the United States, industrial power was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a condition, a constant presence that made every battlefield loss survivable and every victory permanent. It ensured that once momentum shifted, it could not shift back. History often remembers battles and commanders, but beneath them lies a quieter force, the ability to endure. In 1943, German officers began to understand that they were no longer fighting armies alone. They were fighting an industrial system that could not be outlasted. And when the war finally ended, that system remained, intact, expanded, and ready to shape the world that followed. That was the admission few German officers made publicly, but it was the truth they carried with them into defeat.